Welcome to the Metaphorosis magazine podcast, your home for beautifully made speculative fiction. The magazine is edited by B. Morris Allen, and I'm your host, Matt Gomez. This month's story, narrated by the author, is This Is My City and I Am Her Song by Suzanne J. Willis. Suzanne is a lawyer and writer who lives in Melbourne, Australia. Her spare moments are spent with words and music, her stories inspired by fairy tales, ghost stories, and all things strange. Suzanne's first short story collection, Of Starfish, Tides, and Other Tales, was released in 2022 by Trepidatio Publishing. Let's jump in.
The clock stopped still and the night stretched thin as the siren chased me through my city of shifting secrets, across canals and down twisting laneways, until I found myself in the graveyard. It may not have been the most sensible place to hide from a siren, handmaidens of the underworld queen and sisters of death itself, but it was better than being hunted through the streets like a common thief. I peered out from the mausoleum in which I was huddled, and she appeared in the distance, stalking between the headstones and tombs in the endless night. Cursing silently, I couldn't help but feel the same as I had when I first saw her, 16 years before, overwhelmed by the power radiating from her in subtle waves. There has never been any rhyme or rhythm to when the siren visits this city. She has always been peripatetic, unpredictable. I'd been a child, no more than 4 or 5, when I first saw her standing at dawn by the canal, under the bridge that connects the marketplace to the women's quarter. The quarter, it was said, that was home to shapeshifters and shadows. Her hair was a dark, wild tangle, and her black wings arched out from her shoulder blades. I imagined that if she was soaring across the sky, they would block out the sun. My Aunt Zola had raised me on stories, and the one about the siren I learned by heart. The first time she ever told me about it was on the morning I glimpsed the siren under the bridge. When she first came here, my little Rosa, I don't know how she made it from the mountains. The shifters of the women's quarter would bewitch the onshore winds to shear away at those sirens who shouldn't be here. But one morning she was there, huddled under the bridge as though nesting there, all a tremble and bedraggled as a whelp. Ever since, she comes and goes from the city as she pleases, with no knowing when she might turn up. But whenever she does, strange things happen. Stranger than usual, I would always ask. Stranger than the day the sea emptied from the lagoon and left behind the body of the baker's son. Odder than the priestesses who walk the roofs unshod, their feet never touching the earth, and more curious than the cats that guard the ruins of their convent, who howl on the anniversary of the fire that destroyed it. Every time she had a different answer, telling me the stories of our water-bound city and snippets of the fantastic and horrific, weaving it to life. What kind of things? She sighed and touched my cheek. That first time, a great grey wolf was seen prowling the city between sunrise and sunset, but there hadn't been wolves in these parts for over 100 years. Other animals who were left outside after dark, seabirds and cats mostly, were found petrified, their feathers or fur crusted with salt. They lined the canals like statues. And there were other things, too much for young ears to hear. And the lady with the black wings? The last place she always went was across the bridge to the women's quarter. After that, the animals stopped turning to statues and the wolves no longer howled at midnight. None of that has happened in your lifetime, I know, but that doesn't mean that she stays away, as you've seen. And she doesn't find herself here by accident, Rosa. No, she's looking for something. The mournful call of a night bird calling out across the tombs broke my reverie. It was the only sound in the graveyard. The quiet calm of night made me nervous. I know what she's looking for and she hasn't found it yet, I whispered to Zola's memory, closing my hand over the precious cargo in my pocket. I imagined her telling me to walk away, to forget. Cowering there, not knowing when the siren might find me, I was sorely tempted to do just that. Then she walked from the shadows under the weeping trees, making her way between the gravestones. Watching her, not only did I feel the same, but the siren looked the same as she had the first day I saw her so long ago down by the canal. Haunted and tired too. It made me wonder how long she had been looking for that very precious thing. For she had surely been looking long before she reached our city. And what would happen when she found me with it? If only Aunt Zola were here, I could tell her I knew exactly what it was that the siren was after, and ask Zola's help. Ask her, what next? For while I held the lost siren's secret in my cloak pocket, I had not a clue as to what to do with it. Never rely on any man to support you, Aunt Zola had always said, for as long as I could remember. We'll find you a good trade, my girl, and there will be no marriage to yoke you. She was my maternal aunt, the one who took me in when it became clear that my parents would never return from their expedition beyond the mountains. I knew Zola blamed my father for the disappearance of her sister, and that she wouldn't risk the same for me. It suited me just fine. Marriage and children never much interested me, having to answer to a man even less than that. I had harboured a secret hope that Zola might pack us up and move into the women's quarter, even hinted at it once or twice. That's not somewhere just anyone can live, Zola had whispered, shivering at the thought. Witches and medicine women and shapeshifters belong to those streets. It is not for the likes of us. She didn't mention the rumours about what else might live there, for some said it was a refuge for those female monsters who walked the boundary between worlds, between human and beast, between story and reality. She didn't mention it, and I knew better than to ask again. So, at 17, she sent me to the artist Leonardo as his apprentice. The only man, I would add, who not only did not mind an errant girl as his student, but seemed to prefer it. He treated me like an equal, as I sharpened my mind with the books he gave me to read, as I coarsened my hands building machines of his invention. It was my third year with him when he first left me alone over the winter. Zola had been dead some 2 years by then, leaving me without any family to anchor me in the world, though Leonardo was kind and welcoming. I had the feeling he would have given me more responsibility sooner, but that he waited until Zola's death was not so raw, and my grief had healed over a bit. My first task on his departure was to tidy and secure everything, order it for his return in the spring. His notebooks were easy enough, refiled into chronological order. Then there were the small instruments he worked on in his office, the ones that the science school commissioned to use in their experiments. Those went in glass-fronted cases, locked away from the cold, salty air, which would rust their gears and jam their delicate mechanisms. Last was the workshop. The smell of sawdust was warm, comforting, as I put the tools back into place and covered the machine he was working on with large dust sheets. Before my apprenticeship, I'd never realised that machines could be beautiful. But the ones made by Leonardo, all wood and canvas, gears and hinges, were like works of art, their shapes inspired by nature, their purpose sometimes unclear, but certain to move the city ever forward. As I covered the last of them, I noticed that the door to the annex workshop, where Leonardo worked alone, was ajar. I walked over, reached out to close the door, then drew my hand back. Hello? I called softly, for it did not seem as though the workshop was empty. There was no answer, but from the darkness, it felt as though someone had invited me in. I picked up one of the gas lamps and walked through the door, then clicked the taper mechanism my master had created to light the large lamp hanging from the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat. The machine in that little room was like nothing else I had ever seen. Laid across 3 sawhorses was a horizontal frame, bookended by handholds at one end and a swallow's tail at the other, large enough for a full-grown adult to lie in. A tan leather harness joined the base to the upper struts, upon which was fixed an enormous pair of wings. Unlike the other machines in the workshop, they were not made of canvas, but of glossy black feathers, each one oiled and preened and perfect. From the wing joints ran fine copper wires, downward into a nest woven of scraps of twigs and hair, and the soft reeds that grew at the edges of the canal. Had Leonardo, for this he had made surely for himself, been strapped into the contraption, that nest would have sat against the centre of his chest. And in that nest lay an egg, the likes of which should not, could not have existed. Yet there it was. As big as an ostrich egg, it was dark, grey-green, and lit gently from within. The light itself pulsed, and it seemed as though there was an electrical storm trapped inside it, dark clouds passing over its surface. The shell was veined in gold, hair fine and intricate. I hovered my hand above it and it felt warm. Blood heat. The life within it was irresistible, and I began to close my fingers around it. Is it not exquisite? Leonardo's voice was soft, unaccusatory. I turned around, my cheeks warm with shame. But he simply smiled at me as he walked over and gently picked up the egg. I gasped, for as he picked it up, all the feathers from those magnificent wings disappeared, leaving behind wings made of wood frame and canvas. I must have looked like a half-wit standing there gaping at the flying machine that, while still remarkable, looked no different than Leonardo's other workshop creations. He stowed the treasure in his coat. I'm sorry, Rosa. I should never have been so careless and left this where you might find it. I must ask you forget that you ever saw this egg. Owning it. He shook his head, paused as though looking for the right words. Actually, understanding it, seeking its help, takes much knowledge and discipline, and a command of magics that few possess. Without that, it is a dangerous object to be in the presence of, much less attempt to use. And there is not a soul in this city who would not try to use it, given the chance. You felt its pull, no? I nodded and smiled at my master as he left the workshop, trying to disguise the fact that, no matter what he said, the egg had already worked its magic on me. That night, I dreamed I was flying, coal black wings extending out from my shoulder blades, far into the sky. Below me, our city spread out, its secrets laid open to me in all their complexity and wonder. From its streets and the waterways came a lament, sad and terrible, composed of notes not of this world. Then a cry rang out, and the dream went dark. A pounding on the door awoke me from my sleep the next morning, just as the sky was lightening. The young messenger at the door as I opened it looked grave, almost fearful. There has been an accident, Miss Rosa. Your master, Leonardo. He trailed off and I did not want to ask what had happened. His tone, the early hour, already told me that it was not good. "He has no family, miss," said the boy, each word accompanied by a puff of mist from his mouth in the freezing dawn. "So you see, they need you to formally identify the body and assist with—" I held up my hand, not wanting to hit anything else at that moment. My knees felt weak and I was light-headed, as though the world had shifted but I was still in its old kilter. He reached out to steady me, but I drew myself up and waved his hands away. My parents, Aunt Zola, now Leonardo. I had had enough of the clumsy kindnesses that come with death to last me a lifetime. The losses piled onto one another like autumn leaves. If the boy did not touch me, I could just about keep my emotions inside. Wrapped in my warmest coat, I followed the messenger boy out into the morning, trying not to slip on the damp cobbles or lose him in the fog as he hurried through the streets. Already the sounds of the floating markets and the boatmen rang out through the air, waking the city and setting it about its day. It smelled of wood smoke and low tide, and just a little bit of snow that already capped the distant mountains. A shiver passed through me that had nothing to do with the early winter. Though I'd lost someone else, someone I had grown to love, the world went on. At last, we arrived at a little bridge in a hidden laneway that looked rarely, if ever, used. Lawmen and women milled about, some taking notes, others measuring the scene for who knows what purpose. The boy spoke with one of the lawmen, and as I looked about, I realised what the boy must have been saying when I had cut him off so abruptly in the doorway. They needed my assistance to retrieve Leonardo's body, for the bridge did not just lead to any part of the city. It led to the women's quarter. That particular quarter was not somewhere that just anyone could or should wander. Witches and practitioners of other feminine arts did not frighten me so much as the others who had disappeared from the world and made their home in this mysterious part of the city. The shapeshifters and mermaids, the descendants of Delphine who kept their snake tails hidden but still breathed fire at the first sign of trouble. Harpies and their hidden staircase straight to the underworld. All, it seemed, except sirens, who still guarded the mountaintops and the desert plains. I thought of her. I thought of his flying machine and its midnight wings. I wondered. And I wondered what on earth Leonardo could have been doing here and why it had brought him his death. The next few minutes passed in a blur. There was a conversation with the lawman, some brief and useless directions, and absolutely no hint of what I might encounter. Armed with next to nothing, I crossed the bridge as the little crowd fell silent, so the only sound was my boots clomping on the cobbles and the current lazily lapping beneath it. The little square on the other side seemed no different from any of the hundreds in the city proper, except that as I gazed down the laneways, I saw shop signs that were unfamiliar, doorways shimmering into sight, then back into the shadows. Down one of those laneways walked a group of 7 women, all in long, dark cloaks. 6 carried a stretcher bearing a body, and the 7th followed close behind them. Her cry hitched in my throat. I swallowed it down again, and it felt as though, in the odd stillness, I was laid bare for all to see. The 7th woman beckoned to me from the laneway as the 6 stretcher bearers walked into the square and waited. When I reached her, we were out of sight of the lawmen and women. I'd never felt so utterly alone and exposed. The woman peered at me from under her hood. Her face seemed to shift between human and vulpine, not quite settling on either. She looked sad, her eyes red as though she'd been crying. "Did you know Leonardo?" I whispered. "I am Villanelle. Your master was a friend to us here. He spoke highly of you, Rosa." "Don't look so surprised." She smiled. "He had hopes for you, but we've not much time. Take this, it's not safe here." The foxwoman Villanelle reached under her cloak, withdrew a bundle and placed it in my hands. I did not need to ask what it was, for I could feel it, pulsing, a storm barely contained by a golden-veined shell. "What happened to him?" Villanelle shook her head. "He held that egg for longer than should have been possible. It has a different effect on everyone. Anyone who comes into contact with it. He came to broker a deal." She broke off and looked around, though I could hear nothing but the distant flap of wings and call of morning birds. "The Siren agreed many centuries ago to protect our city, for here we gave refuge to creatures and monsters that were hunted elsewhere. In return for that protection, we had to hide something very valuable inside this. Took a strong person to take custody of it." "Leonardo," I said. "As his apprentice and he with no family, the natural laws say that this must pass to you." She brushed my cheek and made a sigil in the air between us, muttering words in a language I did not understand. Panic fluttered in me, but something told me that this was not a curse, but protection. "Tell no one about it. You must hold on to it and keep it from she who seeks it." The Siren? The words were out of my mouth before I'd even formed the thought. But I knew this was what she sought, what all Zola's stories talked about, just as surely as I knew my own name. Her eyebrows rose in surprise, then she smiled. "Leonardo was right about you. Yes, she's here in this city, so you must avoid her at all costs. Do not let her find you or it." "So I run from her this time, then what? Am I to keep this forever?" I wanted to ask more, but she ushered me out of the laneway and into the square. Villanelle pulled back the shroud and I looked at his face, then nodded. It was only as I led the stretcher bearers back across the bridge that I began to cry. How on earth was I to try to avoid a siren? One, no less, who was wandering the world in search of the very thing that I now possessed. I sat in the workshop before Leonardo's flying machine, turning the egg over in my hands. Many of the women in this city were known to walk into the women's quarter as death approached them. But Villanelle had said Leonardo was there to broker a deal. Had someone murdered him for the treasure that I now held? Well, I wouldn't find any answer simply sitting and wondering. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to the flying machine and placed the egg gently in the nest, waiting for the wings to transform into black feathered masterpieces I had not seen 24 hours earlier. And waited. And waited. But the wings stayed canvas and wood, and the machine did not feel as alive as it had the day before. Pulling the egg from the nest, I took it back to my rooms above the workshop and sat by the window, holding it in my lap. Through the open window floated the sounds of the city, the market vendors and the boatmen, the street musicians with mournful violin and haunting flutes, the everyday chatter of people for whom life had not just changed overnight. Villanelle had said that the fragile egg affected everyone differently. Perhaps that gift of flight was only for Leonardo. I closed my eyes, turning the egg over and over in my hands. Against my palms, the siren's treasure pulsed, steady and strong. Images floated in and out of my mind as I was sifting through dreams. A black sand beach stretched under glorious grey skies, upon which sat 7 sirens, singing down passing ships while their cousins, the mermaids, flitted through the waves before the ships crashed to the shore. Under the rain-heavy clouds, the souls of the men flew, shaped as crow and albatross and fledgling gull. The song of the sirens did not just mean death. It was transformative, transmutative. Then a city made of white and black stone, rising from an island, a shack, the humble beginnings of a village, rising and spreading until the death song of the sirens rang through the streets, followed by a rain of fire from the sky. Parliaments of animals and birds gathered to create, break, remake the world. Time stretching and contracting, life and death dancing. And at the centre of it all, the storm egg beating like a heart. The dreams danced over me like rain. The howl of a wolf made me open my eyes suddenly. The light outside was fading and the western sky was soft and gold as a cool wind blew through the window. In the little moment between day and evening, the musicians stopped. The market was packed up. The people closed their shutters and doors. And a song threaded its way through the streets, over the canals on the back of the wolf's howl and the twilight. It was the lost siren calling to the egg. Emotion rose in my throat and I began to cry again. There was a delicate despondency in the refrain. Loss was woven through it. She had been looking for that egg for a very long time. When she sang, "Don't believe for a second that sirens only sing for death," the egg moved restlessly in my hand as though the storms inside it were gathering and waiting to burst. I dared not think about what might happen if they did. All the same, the foxwoman Villanelle had been adamant that the egg should remain in the city. But that did not mean with me. Perhaps I could hide it. I knew enough to know that borderland creatures are tricksy things. So I could not trust the ordinary to tell me how to find a hiding place, how to outrun her. Back down in the workshop, I took out the large map of the city that Leonardo had completed just last spring and traced my finger over the canals and laneways, the little islands and larger districts. Everyone in the city had a small story about her, heard from their parents or grandparents, or learnt through their own encounter. In a city of secrets and wonder, it was Siren who was the most mysterious of all, perhaps because she was not ours. I tried to draw all the stories I had heard together, weaving them into a long thread that would lead me through the labyrinth. I traced the city with my fingertip, whispering as the darkness gathered outside. Once upon a time, the sirens and mermaids were as one, until the sirens took the skies and the mermaids to the deepest seas. That is why she is always seen by the water. My mother was first violinist in the orchestra, and she heard an otherworldly singing under her window when she was practicing one night. When she looked out, there she was, sitting in a peach tree and trilling like a little bird. Like all half-human monsters, sirens are borderland creatures, said to violate the boundaries between life and death, this world and the underworld, the rules of belonging and place. I went on like that for an hour or so, making notes, narrowing down where I thought the siren might be and where she could not reach. I had the egg sat on the table beside me, unwilling to let it out of my sight. Somewhat absent-mindedly, I reached out and rested my hand on it, its shell still warm to the touch. Without quite knowing why, a sob rose in my throat. How short life suddenly seemed. How insignificant. All those I had loved. My parents when I was just a child. My aunt who raised me. Leonardo had given me knowledge and craft and my second home. Were gone. What of their lives unfinished? Turning to grab a handkerchief for my tears, the sad emptiness that had weighted me so suddenly disappeared just as quickly. As soon as I took my hand off the egg. What could I do with more time? I whispered to it. Beneath the shell, the storm raged and lightning struck. Anything the storm promised. The map swam in and out of focus, changing and morphing, some islands sinking beneath the waters and others springing up in their wake. It was as though I was looking at 500 years running through it in a few seconds. Perhaps I was. Then it settled back into its current familiar state, the shadow of a tiny winged figure walking along the banks of the little canal on which Leonardo's workshop passed over the parchment, moth-delicate, then was gone. I grabbed the egg, threw on my cloak and ran out into the night. Only the night was different in ways I could not imagine. Although I have lived in this city my whole life, I managed to find bridges that I did not know existed, pass through neighbourhoods dark and mysterious, as though they had become stuck in another era, and only emerged when needs must. Without a doubt, she was close on my heels as I wound my way through the city. Each time the swoop of her wings or the brisk clack of talons on the cobblestones told me she nearly had me. A turn, right or left, would take me down an odd path and into safety, however temporary. I imagine Leonardo creating his beautiful map in this same way. I'm sure that the minutes did not stop. The night did not pause in the same way. It was as though the world were underwater and I was viewing it, interacting with it through a thin pane of glass, as though I had shifted into a narrow passageway in between the world and the natural forces that kept it going. In a crowded laneway, people moved unusually slow around me, their voices sounding far away. After what seemed like 2 or 3 hours of walking and hiding in the shadows, I passed our astrological clock and it read 11:37, the same time I'd left my rooms. I turned away from the clock, through a passageway and out into a square that sparkled with soft candlelight from hurricane lamps hanging over tables set with wine and fruits, spiced meats and fragrant soups. The air was curiously still, redolent with the sense of the wedding feast. Musicians played a tune I could not hear. Some guests were dancing, others seated, smiling and chatting. Looking at the wedding feast was like watching insects being encased in sap that would slowly turn to amber. A cool wind blew through the square, blowing the candles. Music seemed to explode in the night and I was part of the world again. The dancing made my head spin. Across the square there was a flash of a red tail, a dog or a fox perhaps, drawn out by the smell of food. You have the egg. I froze at the sound of the siren's low voice. Her breath was soft on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat. She seemed to fill the sky even though she was the same height as me. Those black wings arced upwards from her shoulders, and she stretched them outward, a bird readying for flight. I felt a pang for Leonardo and the creation he would never get to test. Why do you want it? Her eyes flashed and my knees turned to water. You might be Leonardo's apprentice child, but you've not earned the right to ask that. She moved towards me and I tensed, ready for her to strike. You knew Leonardo? She smiled at me and it was surprisingly gentle. But before she could answer, the fox I'd seen earlier streaked towards us from the shadows. With her last few steps, she grew, shifted, and came to a stop as Villanelle, standing between me and the siren. You would take back the egg and see our city ruined? I was surprised at the sadness in Villanelle's words. You put too much stock in the old stories, sister. They've become twisted over the centuries and they make you and your kind so unsure of your own place in the world. This city is more yours than it ever was mine. The siren continued in her lilting voice, lulling Villanelle as though mesmerising her. I took my chance. While she was so focused on the foxwoman, I slipped into the shadows, taking the egg with me. When I could no longer hear her, time slowed and I stepped into the in-between spaces once again. I knew then where I was headed. To the city's cemetery, a water-bound island of earthly graves and fiery cremation furnaces. Earth, fire, water. Where better to hide a secret from a creature of the air? I pushed away the niggling worry that had uncurled when the siren spoke to Villanelle. The worry that perhaps I should not be hiding what was rightfully hers at all. The iron gate was set in an ancient stone wall and curlicued with vines and autumn leaves. I tied the boat I had borrowed to the tiny pier, my arms aching from the unfamiliar motion of rowing. I wondered if Villanelle had been entirely enchanted, or worse, by the siren. I hoped she was safe. Beyond the gate, my footfalls were silent on the soft grass. The cemetery's angels and weeping women and ancient mausoleums limned in moonlight. I looked for somewhere safe, secure. A mausoleum, I had decided, would be the perfect hiding place. I walked until I found one whose gate had long since rusted and the names of its dead had been weathered away. As I ducked inside, I heard the rustle of wings, the footfall of clawed feet. How? But of course I already knew that. The egg was calling to her, and I might be able to outrun her for a while, but never truly lose her. Perhaps she was a bit like me, alone in the world. At least I had my city as an anchor, the home I had known all my life, with reminders of Zola and Leonardo, and the parents I knew only through stories, echoing through it. Perhaps she was chasing after her anchor, and it was calling out to be heard, found. I shifted uncomfortably, a discomfort that had nothing to do with the cold stone or the cramped tomb. What if Villanelle was right, and giving the siren what she needed would take away the last part of belonging that I had? Then again, all those years that the siren had searched the city, looking for what I was now complicit in keeping from her. To keep would only add to her suffering. I don't think anyone could have held on to the egg for the time that I had and not understand that. I had plenty of questions, but not a single answer. So I simply sat as still as I could and looked up into the night sky for a long, long time, expecting her to appear at any moment and rip the egg from my grasp. But there were no sounds of her growing any closer, no keening for her egg which sat in my hand, beating softly, and time continued to stretch and move so imperceptibly as to have almost stopped. Above me, the moon, hanging like a scythe, did not continue her journey, and the stars stopped their endless circle. It seemed that the egg was making good on the promise it had made me earlier, when I was silly enough to allow it to know my own sadness. With that one simple question, what could I do with more time? I had revealed myself to it, and with its answer it had caught me like a fish in a net. Anything. There I was, crouched like a cur in the cemetery where more time was as useful as a flying machine to a fish. I could spend forever there, wondering about what to do, about what was right or wrong. Or I could jump and find out. I stepped out of the cold tomb. The siren was nowhere to be seen, though I could feel her traversing this hinterland between the living and the dead. I shivered. The truth of it was, standing so close to death terrified me. All that nothingness stretching out forever. Hello. My voice quivered. The egg skipped a beat, an arrhythmic tell that she must be close by. I'm sorry I ran from you. Behind me, the rustle of folding wings, and the soft crunch of talons in the gravelly path. I turned and there she was, all wild hair and star-bright eyes. Did you know of Leonardo's flying machine? I blurted out. Her smile was unexpectedly beautiful. Oh, yes. We had plans, your master and I, to traverse the skies together. Oh, you're surprised? She touched my face gently, her fingertips cool against my skin. Realization washed over her face. He didn't know about us. He went to Villanelle to negotiate its return, you know. She gestured to my pocket with its exquisitely frangible cargo. Was he? I couldn't finish my question. Murder is such an ugly word. No one would ever have harmed him. He met a most ordinary end. The streets were icy, and he slipped, hitting his head on the stones. He did not suffer. Why did he not just give you the egg? Can you not think of any reason? I racked my brains, ran the old stories through my mind. Oh, he didn't really want to let it go. And you can't just take it back because it must be freely given. I thanked Aunt Zola silently for her fireside stories. The siren smiled. He spoke of you, Rosa. Never did he dream, he told me, that he would find a student who he could imagine one day taking over from him. And then he found you. Had she decided to pluck one of her feathers and poke me with it, she could easily have knocked me over. I have no special talent. God, if I studied his notebooks, his teachings for my whole life, I could never come close to. You underestimate yourself. Did you not take the egg into your care and elude me for a whole night? Has it not listened to you and stretched out time according to your wishes? It hadn't occurred to me that that meant I was something special, and I was not convinced simply because she said so. I was just doing what I was told. Were you now? And what do you think our Leonardo would value more? An apprentice who would simply do what she was told, or an independent thinker? I'll assume that question is rhetorical. We smiled at one another then, sharing the memory of him for just a moment. Villanelle, all the women who work their magic and keep this city safe, they believe that their magic depends on the egg, that if it was returned to me, their magic would wither and die. I put my hand over the egg, warm and safe under my cloak, even though I didn't need to do that to know its power. Why would they think that? I whispered. She stretched her wings, looking up at the unmoving stars as she did so, then folded them against her back again. Under that sliver of moon, she looked like a goddess who was tired of the world she had created. Because inside the egg lies my death. I was jealous that she was able to evade death in that way, and covetous of it too. Now you want to die? I was incredulous that anybody would go looking for death. Around us, the dead were silent in their graves, but I was sure that if they heard us, they would be thinking the very same thing. Death is not the ending that you seem to think it is. I think our friends here would disagree. I motioned towards the graves stretching out on all sides of us. I want to do the right thing, but I don't know what that is. I hated how small my voice sounded, how small I felt. I can't decide that for you, no matter how much I would like to. Just know, Rosa, that I'm very, very tired. She looked older than anyone I had ever met. And the way she was looking at me, somewhere between imploring and pitying, seemed to shift my thinking, and I realised it did not matter how much time I had, whether it was another hour or 10 years or 200 years. Could not undo the hurt or take away pain. It could not make up for the time already lost. It could not change the fact that Leonardo walked that particular path that night, or that my parents left their only child to bring the monster hunters to justice. All those things were immutable and done, never to be redone. No matter how much time there was, it would never be enough, for there would always be things unfinished. There would always be an end for the siren, for the city, for me. I held out the egg to her. Who am I? Who are we to keep this from you? Who was I to stop time or say a city should not sink beneath the waves? As she reached out for it, the town square clocks chimed 13, and a cold breeze that smelled of winter swept through the cemetery. The tempest inside the eggshell roared and raged, cracking it open and sweeping us both up in its arms. I felt like I was falling forever as the siren's feathers drifted from her wings, spinning around us as black snow, unspooling time. Closing my eyes against the raging winds in my mind's eye, I saw an area atop an ancient mountain, spearing towards the sky. In that nest, siren chicks muddled and tumbled and made room for the new egg that formed there at their feet. Death is not the ending that you seem to think it is. Her voice, a voice that bewitched sailors to their deaths and sung a city safe, echoed in my ears as darkness dragged me down. When I awoke, the sky in the east was pale and the sounds of the city waking joined the first bird song. Not only was my home still standing, it felt as though it was stretching outwards, expanding the laneways and digging roots through the sandy bed of the lagoon in search of new ways, new worlds, like a radical searching for the sun. Somewhere in the labyrinth of canals and secrets, the fox women of the women's quarter were weaving new stories of the siren who finally found death inside an eggshell, of how Villanelle and her kind learned that it set them free from old superstition, of letting the future unfold anew, untethered from the past. As for me, I sat in the early morning winter sun and waved the hours, days and years the egg had given me through my thoughts, my memories, my dreams, the way a mermaid braids starfish in her hair. I would keep its gifts of time with me as a companion. Let it teach me to bite like stars on the edge of night and to gamble like devils with their last soul to lose. And when my ending comes, I will turn what is left of it back out into the world, scattered like sea glass on the shore for another lonely, lost girl to find and learn what it is to live.
That was This Is My City and I Am Her Song by Suzanne J. Willis. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you listen to us on. Or better yet, share the magazine and podcast with a friend. If you'd like to listen to more speculative fiction, visit us online at magazine.metaphorosis.com, on Blue Sky at metaphorosis.bsky.social, or on Mastodon at metaphorosis@writing.exchange.